Our next speaker really is a driving force in the state of Utah for the change that they are undergoing with the digital transformation. So without any further ado, Senator Howard Stephenson from the state of Utah.
Thank you so much, David. I'm so happy to be here with you today. I just flew in from Washington, D.C., where I was presenting on Utah's dual language immersion program. We have more kids in dual language immersion than any state of the nation. That was also my legislation. And I was talking there about how that can supply our national defense, national security, and international business with the linguists they need. And if you want to talk about that, I'd be happy to help evangelize on that also. But I'm a true believer in digital teaching and learning because I learned many years ago the power of personalized learning and how teachers can exponentiate their capacity by trusting the machine to assist in the heavy lifting of instruction and assisting kids in the heavy lifting of learning. I want to talk today about the power of deliberate practice, and that's something that I'm going to delve into a little bit quite deeply about what it can do. And I want to tell you that I have a promise that I make to education faculties. I've been training entire school faculties in what they can do to deliver grade level proficiency for every student in their school. Not improving it 10%, but getting at least 90% proficient and then having the time to deal with the remaining 10%. And I promise you that you can get at least 90% of the kids in your classroom or in your school proficient in math and reading. And that's what I'm focusing on here, is because that's what the national and state tests are focusing on. And if we can't get 90% plus proficient there, then we don't have time to focus on the rest of the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, such as evaluation, synthesis, creativity, collaboration, and those things that are far more joyful and that are more easily done through the project-based learning and the kinds of things that you've been talking about in the last couple of days. But it will only happen if these tools are used with fidelity. But first, I want to talk about vulnerability. Self-help expert Brene Brown talks about embracing our vulnerability, and I want us all to do that today as we anticipate how we can give 90% proficiency to every student. And it requires repentance on each of our parts. Victor Hugo, probably in the book Les Miserables, talks about the most powerful repentance process in literature. And in the movie, and by the way, the one on the right, doesn't that look like Leilani when she was little? Of course, she's still little, but it kind of looks like her, doesn't it? The book has been turned into movies and into musicals, and the most important part of the book is not spoken of in the musical or any of the movies that have been made about it. You remember when the priest gives Jean Valjean the two candlestick holders when the police bring him back, and the priest knows that if he tells them that he stole my silver, he will go to prison for the rest of his life. And the priest was not willing to be responsible for that. And he said in front of the police, "You left the best behind," and put the candlestick holders in his bag. And Jean Valjean weeps and wonders, why is this man so kind to me? That was not Jean Valjean's repentance process. Because later that day, after the priest said, "Take this silver and become an honest man," he was on a trail resting. He was going to another part of France where he wouldn't be known, where he could start his life new. He was resting on the trail when a little chimney sweep came whistling down the trail, jangling some coins in his hand. And one of the coins dropped out and fell on the ground by Jean Valjean. And he snatched it up and kept it in his hand. And the little boy protested and cried and said, "Give me my coin." And Jean Valjean wouldn't do it because he was still the man he was for 19 years in prison. He was bitter, angry, and vengeful. And that's who he was at that moment. And then the little boy went crying down the trail. And Jean Valjean turned to the bag of silver and looked at the coin that he had just stolen from that little chimney sweep. That was the transformation. He realized that he needed to repent. I'd like you to consider, and all educators should be considering, the ways you may be stealing from the chimney sweeps in your stewardship. I invite you to be open to the opportunities to disrupt the status quo culture of adults conforming to the traditions and expectations of other adults, and consider what you need to change in your life to stop stealing from the chimney sweeps in your school system. I have to tell about my own repentance process. I was that guy, I was that conservative, most conservative legislator in the state of Utah who thought that schools should not be social service providers. Doggone it. They should just teach the 4 R's and do it well, and the rest will take care of itself. I opposed school breakfast, extended day kindergarten, after-school programs, elementary counselors and psychologists, pre-K funding, and home visits. Because by darn, I was a conservative and I worried about the proper role of government. And then my wife and I volunteered for 5 years at the Salt Lake Valley Youth Detention Facility, where I met firsthand those young people that I had denied after-school programs. So they wandered their neighborhood looking for belonging and finding it in gangs and winding up in lockup facilities. I denied them the school breakfast that they needed to have the blood glucose in their brains to do the work of learning, because by darn, our kids go to school fed. Why would government need to feed our kids breakfast? I was basing it on my neighborhood, my kids. But Julie and I learned very early on that the only difference between those kids we were training every Sunday and then training life skills on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, the only difference between them and our kids was environment. If our kids had been swapped at birth in the hospital, we would have been visiting our kids. The only difference was environment. So I have repented of my uninformed positions and now make efforts to restitution of those at-risk kids. I support school breakfast. I support extended day kindergarten. I support after-school programs. In fact, this year I sponsored and got funded the elementary school psychologists for those kids who are suffering that toxic stress because they're experiencing things that my children never imagined in their lives. The abuse, the violence that these kids are suffering, they need those psychologists in those schools. I also sponsored the most effective pre-K program in the history of education, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. And I agree with home visits to give these parents the parent efficacy skills that they need to be effective. You remember in 1983, we had the Nation at Risk report, which showed that if a foreign power had imposed this system on us, we would have considered it an act of war. So what's happened since then? Not much. In fact, the Reagan Institute Summit on Education invited me back a couple of months ago to Washington, D.C. to the 35th anniversary of the Nation at Risk report. And on that stage, for those 2 days, and by the way, I didn't go because I was afraid I would go postal when I was there. I'm serious. I was afraid I would go postal because I've been accused of being a bully when I've gone postal before, when I see people who are stealing from chimney sweeps. They had every living Secretary of Education on the stage during those 2 days. And as I listened to the podcast of that later, my wife was wondering, what is happening with you? Why are you so upset? Because all of those people, who are now all millionaires, by the way, you make a lot of money stealing from chimney sweeps. You really do. They had the audacity to sit on that stage and pontificate and say, yeah, we haven't changed. Nothing's better. Education is still as bad as it was. In fact, the day before this conference, the new NAEP report card came out, which showed that 2/3 of American school children are not proficient in math or reading. And they had the audacity to get on the stage and talk about it. If the airline industry failed to get 2/3 of us where we needed to be, would we allow the CEO on a stage to talk about it? If our food industry, if our car industry, and yet education, somehow it's just fine. So the NAEP scores, the white pieces there are no change. The yellow are a reduction from the 2 years before NAEP scores. So we're not only stagnant, we're getting worse. But thank heaven that at least the 90th percentile, those kids that are already doing well, they're doing 2 points better. So at least we're succeeding somewhere, right? This is stealing from Chimney Sweeps. America spends more per student than any nation on earth. And yet, we steal from Chimney Sweeps. More than 20% of high school students drop out before graduation. And of those who do graduate, 2/3 are not proficient in math or reading. And among the industrialized nations, the US ranks below the median in all subjects tested, math, reading, and science. This is a disaster. We should be marching in the streets. And yet, it's the best daycare system in the world. It truly is. The PISA scores show those highest ranking countries do things that we are not doing. And I'm not going to get into that right now because what I want to talk about is how the brain works and why machine-based learning can personalize learning for every child and do the heavy lifting of instruction in math and reading. That's what I'm focusing on now, math and reading, because that's what America focuses on. And if without the foundation on Bloom's taxonomy of academic skills and content knowledge in math and reading, you're not going to get those higher levels of performance either. So the Harvard Center on the Developing Child has shown that a child develops its own brain architecture through something called serve and return. When the infant serves something to a coo, a sound, a cry, a glance, a burp that you think they're smiling, they get something in response. They get a return. And that creates the brain architecture that serves later. That child is an explorer, and they reach out with a jerky motion like a stroke patient recovering that motion, and they reach for that object and put it in their mouth, which is their laboratory at that age, and they are self-directed learners. We have 100 billion cells connected 10 trillion ways in the human brain, more stars than in the Milky Way galaxy. And the brain research has shown that in order to learn, you need to exercise agency. It requires volition on the part of the students. So the child makes an attempt, and the neurons reach out and form potential intelligence. The only way that becomes permanent is when you get a response immediately in the moment of the attempt as to whether you were correct or incorrect. When you get that in the moment of the attempt, there are 3 chemicals released in the brain which seal the connection. If you don't get that feedback, the neurons retract. One of those chemicals is dopamine, and that's why authentic learning is always joyful. Authentic learning is never painful, and yet we make it painful by sending kids home to do 30 algebra problems on paper without any response. They turn in the paper the next day, they get red marks on it telling you, you're not good at math. When in fact, every one of us is a math genius in embryo, which if we were getting immediate interactive feedback while doing the problem, we would all be getting it. This is why these kids are so excited about these games. They suffer 1,000 deaths, and then they go back and start over again. Why? Because they're getting dopamine. Dopamine is what drives it. We talk about man's search for happiness, but it's really man's search for dopamine. And I'll tell you, you have the capacity of winning the war on drugs more than all the DEA agents combined. Because when you teach students to make their own authentic dopamine, they won't be seeking it in illicit ways. Another thing that happens is serotonin. When those neurons reach out and you get immediate feedback, not only is dopamine released, which makes it joyful, but serotonin, which makes you more excited about continuing to try, continuing to know things. There's a pecking order among wolves that the highest serotonin level wolves are the ones that are leader of the pack. And similar in games, that's why at halftime the coach gives that pep talk, because it literally increases serotonin levels in the blood of the players so that they are now going to be more desirous, more focused on winning. So we talk about men's search for serotonin because nothing succeeds like success. And this is what you get. The pictures here show the kids that are succeeding, getting the serotonin and the dopamine, and those that are not getting it. As I said, we can train kids to make their own dopamine and not seek it in illicit ways. Anders Ericsson and Robert Poole have written an amazing book called Peak. Anybody in here familiar with this book? It is must-reading because it talks about deliberate practice, the power of deliberate practice. He debunks Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours. He said, there are golfers who have golfed 40,000 hours in their lifetime, and they're no better today than they were when they began because they're not doing focused practice, deliberate practice. And that's what machine-based learning can empower your students to do and give them immediate interactive feedback. As you know, the digital teaching and learning river is a mile wide and an inch deep. But there's a part of that river that I'm talking about today called computer-assisted instructional software that can give immediate interactive feedback to every response. And that's how we can get at least 90% of our students at grade level proficiency in math and reading. It respects the style and the pace of every learner, rather than sage on the stage, standing in front of 30 kids with a bell-shaped curve that is 5 years wide between the top and the bottom students in each class, and this bell-shaped curve, so they teach to the middle of the curve in order to be efficient. The kids on the right are bored, the kids on the left are lost. But this respects the pace of every learner. Most one-to-one computer programs actually result in lower student performance because they don't know the hell what they're doing with those one-to-one devices. We saw what happened in Los Angeles Unified when they flooded it. I can give you example after example. It's not about the device, it's about what is delivered with the device to give immediate interactive feedback. 95% of computer-assisted instructional software also is not used with fidelity. Why? Because of lack of focus, vision, leadership, belief it's about the devices, insufficient PD, lack of integration in the instructional model, failure in the dose rates and frequency and duration, ignoring the prescriptive teacher interventions. Ignaz Semmelweis was a medical doctor in Vienna, Austria, in a maternity hospital where a third of the women were dying following childbirth. He thought this was before germ theory, and he thought it must be the doctors that are causing the deaths of their patients. So he required them to wash their hands in a mild solution of chlorine bleach when the mortality rate dropped to less than 2%. You would have thought that would be the solution, but his immediate supervisor demanded that they stop that silly practice of hand washing, and he spent the rest of his life, 20 years, trying to convince the medical community of his findings until he was lured to a mental hospital on false pretenses where they put him in a straitjacket and they beat him because of his protests. He died 2 weeks later, ironically, of infection to his wounds. This is what's happening today with education. We have the solution to give all children proficiency, and we're not doing it. You know, if they had known about this in the Civil War, we could have saved 250,000 soldiers. There are 206,000 that died in battle, 337 who died of disease from their doctors. Germ theory was finally advanced, as we know. You know the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. What if we were to have that in our education system? First do no harm. Because I'll tell you, we're doing a lot of harm with the imprecise and archaic practices of sage on the stage, spray and pray, and hope it all works. And they're just not willing to let go of the imprecise practices of the past. And why are we doing this? Because Horace Mann and Edward Thorndike taught us to segregate all of our classes into 50-minute slots. Edward Thorndike taught us that intellect is fixed at birth and you can't change it, so the job of education is to rank and sort students by their intellect, not to increase it. A to F letter grades we're clinging to that because we believe that we're going to just rank and sort students by their intellect. In fact, not knowing that they have the ability for every student to be proficient in everything. And that's what the book Peak talks about. This one-size-fits-all education system is failing our kids. And our high-stakes end-of-level tests are not designed to benefit students. They're designed to benefit adults, thinking they're holding each other accountable. I'm going to take a break from my seriousness now to remind you of how bad sage on the stage can actually be. So let's roll the video.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the, anyone? The Great Depression, passed the, anyone? The tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which, anyone raised or lowered? Raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression. Today, we have a similar debate over this. Anyone know what this is, class? Anyone? Anyone seen this before? The Laffer curve. Anyone know what this says? It says that at this point on the revenue curve, you will get exactly the same amount of revenue.
Well, that's a pretty bad example, but there's too much of that going on in our schools today because we're not personalizing learning for these students. We're not allowing the machine to do the heavy lifting of instruction in a personalized way. You're all familiar with Carol Dweck's growth mindset work, that it's not that we can't learn it, it's that all of us can. It's just a matter of getting it in our way and our time. We have all of these excuses for failing schools, and they're all bogus. You know, we blame the kids for being in poverty, diversity, family disintegration, English learners, uncooperative parents, ADHD, special needs. Well, how do you expect us to do well with that? Well, you've all seen these regression lines that show the income of parents of the family, for example. The kids up here do well, the kids down here don't. Education attainment of parents, same thing. You can see all of these regression lines. I'm here to tell you that your school is not measured by the kids at the upper right of that regression line. Your school is measured by the kids down on the left. Those are the canaries in the mine that tell what your school is actually doing. So we look at the demographics of schools and we say, oh, that school's doing well. No, I don't know that until I look at how the students who are the canaries in the mine in that school are actually doing. And I can tell you that they are just as capable of being brought up to grade level proficiency as any other students. And I want to talk to you about how that is done. And I'm going to go directly because John Piaget and Benjamin Bloom have all proven that anybody can learn. We can all be given the proficiency if we get immediate interactive feedback. And you know, it's interesting that they've been taught in colleges of education for all of their other findings, but you won't find a single college of education that talks about their claim that when you get immediate interactive feedback, proficiency climbs exponentially. So I want to talk about some specific examples of immediate interactive feedback in Utah's school system. We have the Upstart program, which is for 4-year-olds. We now have 15,000 4-year-olds who get Rusty and Rosie, 2 raccoon cartoon characters, giving them exercises 20 minutes every day during their 4-year-old 9-month school calendar at home, with parents given efficacy training once a week as they're called. They're advised to read to their kids at night, of how they can encourage their kids. These kids are on there with proficiency using this software at home without any bricks and mortar pre-K. And we now have the results. As you can see, this red box shows what kindergartners should learn. These kids enter kindergarten at a 1st grade level. They already know everything the teacher is going to teach them that year. The Pew Charitable Trust brought the states together, the 11 states that didn't have a pre-K program in Big Sky, Montana. They got these teams together, and we decided we don't have the money to have a bricks and mortar pre-K, so we're going to see if we can just add value to what parents are already spending on their 4-year-olds. And now we find that the non-cognitive benefits are just as valuable as the cognitive, because these kids have self-confidence. It prevents the stigma of grouping students. They have a sense of well-being, positive attitude towards school from the student and their parents, fewer absences, and social emotional growth. Silas is the son of a single dad who was on the Upstart program as a 4-year-old. His dad told me about when he took him in for his evaluation with his kindergarten teacher. Silas, a kid who wouldn't have been on a trajectory of success normally, but he had been with Rusty and Rosie on the Upstart program for 9 months as a 4-year-old. He walks in, and after introductions, Silas stands up and says, "Mrs. Jones, I'm the smartest kid in your class." That's serotonin speaking. That's confidence. He goes over and grabs a book and starts reading it to her. And then he notices a number chart from 1 to 100 over on the wall, and he starts pointing at numbers and saying what they are. And then he starts to get really smart-alecky, and he says, 7 plus 3 is 10. He knew everything the teacher was going to teach. And so the teacher arranged to put him in the 1st grade reading group so he wasn't disruptive during the time that she was teaching kids alphabet sounds. And she asked Silas's dad, would it be okay if I assigned Silas to be a mentor for these 3 boys that have an affinity with him? And so in that first week of school, he realizes, I am the smartest kid in my class. And that confidence is going to follow him through. In fact, we now have 5-year longitudinal data that shows that these kids in 4th grade are still 30 to 40 points above in proficiency level than their peers who are not on the program, even though the only difference was what happened when they were 4-year-olds in this Upstart program. High-quality math software, when integrated in the instructional program, can also give this 90% plus proficiency level. We have this STEM Action Center math grants that initially were not used with fidelity, but after a couple of years, we finally got teachers to accept the machine to do the heavy lifting of math instruction. And now the students that are on the program were up to 3 times more frequently at grade level than their peers who were not using the math software. This is 75 middle school kids. When I walked into that school, I thought, how can you have middle school kids, 75 of them in one room without it being chaos? You could have heard a pin drop, because these kids are getting dopamine in their classroom. Instead of kids going home and crying over their math homework, these kids were getting immediate interactive feedback, and they're succeeding. We also have K-3 reading intervention software And Mrs. Olson showed how this can work in her classroom. She had 38 kids in a dual language immersion class, half in the morning and half in the afternoon. The 2 bars on the left show the morning class. The 2 bars on the right show the afternoon class. As you can see, the skill progress. When she began, less than a third of her class were at grade level proficiency. That's the column on the left part of each one. On the right column, with the dark blue, that shows that they're a year ahead now in both the morning and the afternoon. It looks like 60% of them are a year ahead. And there's only 2 kids who were not at grade level. Only 2 out of the 38. Find me that anywhere in the world where you have that kind of gain in one academic year. I guarantee you, if you trust the machine to do the heavy lifting instruction, if you take the prescriptions given by the machine for one-on-one and small group instruction, you can get 90% plus. In her case, it was 95%. And you know those 2 kids who didn't make grade level, they made the biggest gains of all. They were special ed kids who were at a pre-K level at the beginning of the year, and now they're reading proficiently at 3rd grade. I went to the awards ceremony to give the awards to these kids, and we brought them up one at a time and announced what their progress was, because they were all winners. Not like soccer where every kid gets a trophy. No, these kids had made an average of 2.5 years growth. And this could happen nationwide. We could have 90% plus of all of our kids at grade level if we would trust the machine to do the heavy lifting of instruction. I was in the auditorium with them, and the parents were filled the auditorium. I've never seen more tears in a school than I saw that day. I want to close with the story of Todd Rhodes. He was a 7th grade misfit in Hooper, Utah, who was in the principal's office for one more time, this time for throwing a stink bomb at the blackboard in art class as a junior high kid. He was given another week of suspension. By the time he reached senior at Layton High School, he was unable to graduate because his grade point average was 0.9. And he knew that if I get straight A's by the end of the year, I still won't graduate. So he drops out. His girlfriend happens to be pregnant, and they get married. They just loved each other so much. And so he struggled with 2 jobs. They would steal toilet paper from public restrooms, borrow diapers from neighbors. And finally his dad said, "Get your GED and get to college." So he enrolled in Weber State University. He graduated with a GPA of 3.95. This kid who had failed high school. He presented a paper in Sweden in his senior year, and then was accepted to Harvard, where he now runs the Center on Individual Opportunity, saying we should stop pounding square pegs in round holes. And if you're doing Sage on the Stage, you're pounding square pegs in round holes. If you're sending kids home to do their math homework without immediate interactive feedback, you're pounding square pegs in round holes. And you're stealing from Chimney Sweeps. You're getting paid to do your job. And if you're not getting at least 90% proficiency, you are stealing from Chimney Sweeps. Todd's story has a happy ending, but every student in America deserves to have the same happy ending. You've all heard the story of the starfish thrower, where the man is on the seashore, where there's thousands of starfish that are washed up on the shore in a freak storm. The tide is receding, the sun is coming out, and he knows the starfish will die. So he picks up one and throws it in, and another man comes by and says, "What are you doing?" "I'm saving starfish, but you can't possibly make a difference. There are tens of thousands of them." He picks up another one and throws it in and says, "I made a difference for that one." Now, most educators, when they hear that story, it gives them a warm feeling. It doesn't give me a warm feeling at all, because what it does is it admits that we are satisfied with leaving tens of thousands of kids, tens of thousands of chimney sweeps that we're stealing from and we're not making a difference for. We have the capacity to re-immerse all the starfish in a rich learning environment through the use of digital means if we do it with fidelity. We have the capacity to re-immerse them all in a rich learning environment and save them all. And I guarantee you, if you will apply these principles, that we can get at least 90% of every American child at grade level proficiency in math and reading. And then we can do the exciting things that you've been talking about here in the higher levels of instruction and higher levels of learning. Thank you very much.